All right, let's dive right into this explainer. The massive Stanford AI Index 2026 just dropped, and man, it is already dominating the entire AI conversation. But look, instead of just regurgitating the headlines like everyone else, we are going to learn how to look at this thing with a highly critical eye. We're going to audit the index together so we can finally separate actual, measured AI reality from all the interpretive hype.
Futurist and post-labor economist Thorsten Mayer actually gives us the perfect framework for our analysis today. He explicitly warns us that treating this highly influential document as just, unmediated fact rather than a curated snapshot leads to conclusions the underlying data simply doesn't support. Mayer points out that a document written for a policy and executive audience, especially in an industry where the most capable models disclose the absolute least, simply cannot be read uncritically. You've got to use a critic's pen.
And to really grasp why auditing this matters so much, you have to understand the sheer scale and influence of the index itself. We're talking about a 9th edition report spanning well over 400 pages across 11 dense chapters. It's literally the single most cited annual document on artificial intelligence. It dictates how policymakers draft laws, how journalists write their headlines, and how executives frame their entire AI strategy for the year. That massive authority, that's exactly why we have an absolute obligation to audit it.
So to make this super efficient for you, we'll break it down step by step. We're going to cover reading the AI report card, where the index really shines, its structural biases and blind spots, the benchmark saturation problem, and finally, exactly which numbers you can trust.
Okay, starting with part 1, reading the AI report card and establishing our baseline.
Let's be clear up front. Stanford's program is genuinely rigorous, and our critical audit operates entirely within that baseline of intellectual seriousness. But here is the crucial point. You have to contrast these two methodologies. The index is incredibly reliable when it comes to counted facts, things like publication volumes, benchmark scores, or the actual dollar amounts of capital flows. But you need to apply heavy skepticism to their interpreted summaries, things like absolute consumer value or workforce displacement data. Mayer's rule of thumb here is absolutely essential. Anchor yourself on the counted facts and treat those interpretive claims with proportionate skepticism.
Moving on to part 2, where the index shines, because it does have some unbeatable rigor.
Credit where credit is due. The report genuinely shines in a few key areas. Its benchmark performance tracking is highly traceable, mapping out AI achievements step by step. They also do the absolute grueling work of cross-jurisdictional policy tracking, literally counting laws and regulations across more than 30 jurisdictions globally. But honestly, perhaps its best quality is its intellectually honest, jagged frontier framing. It readily admits that, yeah, AI can do graduate-level math reasoning, but it still completely fails to use the common sense required to just read an analog clock. That kind of self-qualification rarely appears in industry-aligned reporting, and it's a massive strength here.
And this point right here brilliantly illustrates their structural honesty. Look at this dramatic drop in the Foundation Model Transparency Index score. It plummeted from 58 down to 40 year over year. The fact that Stanford HAI publishes a transparency assessment giving top AI labs incredibly poor scores, that proves they are actively pushing back against industry opacity. They aren't just out there cheerleading for vendors. They are explicitly calling out the fact that this industry is becoming increasingly closed off.
Which brings us to part 3, structural biases and blind spots. This is where we pivot.
Now, what's really interesting here is looking at the structural constraints the index actually faces. One massive blind spot is adoption metric conflation. For example, you might see a massive, flashy headline claiming 53% global generative AI adoption. But that number? It is incredibly fragile. Why? Well, because the underlying data completely fails to separate a user who tried a tool like ChatGPT exactly one time from a power user who pays a monthly subscription and grinds on it for hours every single day. This makes cross-country comparisons highly skewed, because countries with high one-time trial adoption look exactly the same on paper as countries with deep, sustained daily use.
We also see structural bias in how the data is framed. The index frames public sentiment by leading with the fact that 59% of global respondents are optimistic about AI benefits. Sounds great, right? But wait, that very same dataset shows that 52% of people feel nervous about AI. And that nervousness is actually at its highest absolute level in the entire time series. A completely different steering committee could look at this exact same data and rightfully headline that over half the entire world is nervous about AI. It's just a prime example of how curation totally shapes the narrative.
All right, part 4, the benchmark saturation problem. Let's do a deep dive.
I actually want to slow down our pacing for a second here because this is the single most urgent methodological constraint you need to understand right now. As the gap between these tests visually compresses, you can clearly see that AI models are defeating these benchmarks way faster than human researchers can even invent them. Tests that were designed to challenge AI for years are literally getting saturated in months. So what you should take away from this is that benchmarks are actually lagging indicators. If you anchor your view of AI progress solely on these saturated benchmarks, you are going to dramatically underestimate the actual, real-time advances happening out there at the frontier.
Finally, part 5, which numbers to trust and your actionable takeaways.
Okay, let's equip you with a highly practical cheat sheet so you know exactly which numbers you can confidently quote tomorrow morning. Using Meyer's executive matrix, we can build up those critical reading skills. For foundation transparency, you can quote that year-over-year drop directly. It is highly reliable. But when it comes to those massive economic claims, like $172 billion in consumer value, you've got to realize that is derived from highly fragile willingness to pay surveys. For those, quote the directional trend, like, say, the fact that perceived value is tripling, but heavily caveat the absolute dollar amount. It could easily have a massive margin of error.
So, the next time you see a massive valuation headline throwing around numbers like $172 billion in consumer value, remember to contrast that fragile survey-based claim against meticulously counted facts. For example, a super reliable counted fact from the report is that robots currently succeed in only 12% of real household tasks. One of these is a firm, grounded reality, the other is a fragile estimate. You just always need to know which one you're citing.
Ultimately, whether you're a policymaker drafting legislation, an executive allocating capital, or a journalist writing the news, applying this specific strategic discipline ensures you're using the document responsibly. Read the methodology appendix. Quote those clean, measurable counts directly. And please heavily caveat the sweeping summaries. Doing so ensures you are navigating by a true compass and not just blindly propagating industry marketing.
We've covered a lot of ground today auditing the world's most influential AI explainer. We've seen its unbeatable rigor in tracking policies and models, but we've also exposed its blind spots when it comes to human sentiment and actual sustained adoption. So, the very next time you encounter an eye-popping AI statistic from any major report, take out your critic's pen and ask yourself one final question. Are we measuring AI's actual progress or just its marketing?